I look like I'm either a pirate or I'm ready to tell someone's fortune. We have a guest with us today. My brother is making not an appearance, but we're gonna hear his voice. He hasn't showed up in my... Today I wanted to discuss the toxic culture behind the fashion industry and the multiple facets in which that expresses itself. Fashion is something that I was always interested in. I started a fashion blog back in 2009, and since then I've always been interested in fashion in different ways, and in the last 5 years I've been interested in sustainable fashion and ethical fashion. So I feel like I'm very knowledgeable on multiple different categories in the fashion industry. I've also modeled a little bit, not anything impressive, but in general, I feel like I have enough experience within this industry. So looking back into the past and exploring fashion history, it's very interesting how basically fashion started the moment that we started making clothes. And there's archaeological evidence from back to 30,000 years ago where they found that Stone Age people's clothes were made out of animals or fabrics, but they've also found that around 100,000 years ago, Neanderthals at the time were making their own clothes. So it's not something that was exclusive to Homo sapiens. But they've also found even back to 170,000 years ago, people even back then were making clothes. So following the agricultural revolution, women became the primary garment making fashionistas, I guess. They took part in knitting and sewing, in pattern making, embroidery, spinning wool, like every single part of the garment production. Pretty much women were at the front of it. And it was one of the very few creative outlets for women at the time, so they really went to town with making garments as extra, as impressive, as artistic as they possibly could. And that just makes it a bigger shame that garment making was never really considered a fine art, which is mainly because women were doing it, you know? So looking back at our ancestors and what their traditional clothing looked like, it's very interesting to look at the stark difference between how we dress now and how our ancestors dressed. Me being half Greek and half Portuguese, I look at the traditional outfits and they're just so beautiful. And then I am here dressed up like what? I do want to take a moment to appreciate the fashion of my culture because specifically from the Greek side, I am obsessed with Minoan fashion. The Minoan civilization were located in current Crete, and they were some of the very few cultures at the time that didn't view women as property and were pretty egalitarian as far as I know. It's also rumored that they might have been cannibals, but honestly, like, I'll take egalitarianism with a side of cannibalism over being considered property any day. What's amazing about Minoan fashion is that the dresses on women exposed the bosom area. And what I've noticed is usually when civilizations don't over-sexualize female bodies, those civilizations also tend to be a little more forward-thinking, a little more progressive, a little more respectful towards women. So you can see how the culture is expressed through how the women are dressed. And honestly, these outfits are badass. The colors are amazing, the shapes, the prints. Everything about this look is regal, it's fashionable, it's powerful. I love everything about Minoan fashion, to be honest. And then there's the Portuguese fashion, which is a little more recent. Every area in Portugal had its own traditional outfits. I feel like all of these are kind of close to my aesthetic, and I feel like with a few alterations, I could actually incorporate Portuguese fashion into my personal style pretty easily. And I really love the white blouses and how they're combined with different prints and with the voluminous skirts. My favorite fashion in Portugal, though, is from where my mom is from, which is the Azores Islands. And it's these black capes with these massive hoods that very much remind me of The Handmaid's Tale. Serious dystopian vibes with these hoods, and I absolutely love them. They scream, "Stay away from me, don't look at me, I don't want to be perceived," and I really want to get myself one of these capes. Also, both our grandmothers used to work as seamstresses. Our great-grandmother also used to work in a sweatshop.
My grandmother used to work in a sweatshop. If you also want to work in a sweatshop,
Try Skillshare. No, but if you do want to learn more about making clothes or become better at it, or just in general explore your creativity, then I highly recommend trying out today's sponsor, Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of inspiring classes that can help you with the first steps towards making your own clothes. If you're into sustainable fashion and have scrap fabric that you want to upcycle, I highly recommend the class Sewing and Upcycling. Make your clothes unique using applique by artist and designer Vida Vazquez. This has probably been my most favorite Skillshare class so far. The process of coming up with the applique designs kind of took me down a rabbit hole of exploring global fashion history, and it also helped me pinpoint everything that inspires me creatively at the moment. And I can't wait to use what I learned in this class on more sewing projects in the future. The first 1,000 people to use the link in my description will get a free trial of Skillshare Premium membership, and after that it's only around $10 a month. Skillshare offers membership with meaning. Connect with the support of fellow creatives and enter a community of encouragement, communication, and inspiration. So whether you're looking to fend off boredom, focus on self-care through creativity, or join a similarly creative community, Skillshare is the place to keep you learning. So remember how I said that fashion has existed ever since we started making clothes? Well, the top Google result thinks otherwise, and they credit a white man in 1826 with being the first fashion designer. The audacity of something that women have been doing since the beginning of time has literally credited to a white man in 1826.
It should be credited to
me. So about 100 years after that supposed first fashion designer, something does start going amiss in fashion in general, because we start going from wearing this to wearing this.
I have absolutely nothing against basics, and this isn't me shaming people for wearing basics. I wear basics all the time as well. They're practical and comfortable. But what I want to demonstrate to you through this series of photos is the complete lack of individualism within modern fashion. What I've done is I've gathered recent pictures of crowds of people from all across the world. And these are people with different ethnic backgrounds, different religions. Some are living under communism, some are living under capitalism. But what all of these people have in common is that they're wearing the same exact uniform. Personally, I think individualism and collectivism are tools that can either be used positively or negatively. And specifically when it comes to fashion, I do think that individualism should be encouraged. I am very confused in how modern capitalist society, which is so extremely theoretically individualist, would tackle fashion specifically in such a collectivist way. And it's amazing how the people that are the most critical of collectivist ideologies are also the most likely to dress in a more uniform and collectivist way. It's fascinating. People all across the planet were way more experimental and daring with the clothing that they used to wear compared to us today. They were not afraid of eccentric head accessories. As a matter of fact, they weren't afraid of eccentric makeup either. Look at this guy. Look at all the colors and the prints, the way that this clothing is shaping his body. It's amazing. I hear people a lot of times complain in hot weather that they can't be stylish because they can't wear a lot of things, but clearly this is not an issue for these guys. Look at the jewelry, the head accessories, the prints on the fabric. Everything ties in perfectly together. And look at her. Absolutely stunning. You'd think she's going to the Met Gala, but that hut in the back is probably her home, and she's about to milk a cow or something. And these ladies, I mean, if anyone in the fashion industry dressed like this, they would be considered an icon. And for them, it seems pretty effortless. And look at this queen. I'm getting excited just looking at these outfits, because these outfits actually have things that you can look at compared to the first photos that we saw. And this headpiece, I don't even know what it is. I don't know what it's made out of. I don't care. I don't want to know. Magic, probably. It's amazing. And even in this look where there are no vibrant colors, you can still see the fashion shining through it. From the quality of the fabric to the braids in her hair that are peeking through underneath the headscarf, the makeup on her face, the jewelry. It's simple details that make her look expensive and fashionable. Even these little munchkins have more style than you're ever gonna have. That little kid is laughing because it knows we all look like shit. Oh my god, I'm turning into Regina George. I need to stop.
So I remember when I traveled to Bali, which was in 2017, I think. I was staying in this hotel, and I don't know if I've said this story before, but I was going through a photo book of a German photographer that traveled to Bali in like 19 something.
The book contained pictures of the Balinese people before Bali started getting exploited as a tourist destination and before it became westernized. And what really stood out to me was the way that the people in Bali were dressed, which was completely different than what I saw when I traveled there. People were dressed in beautiful sarongs, which is a type of fabric with usually very intricate prints on it. And similar to the Minoan culture, the Balinese people didn't shame women for having bodies.
Y'all, I just learned that pre-colonialism, Desi women didn't wear blouses under their saris. They just wore the sari, no blouse. They were forced to wear the blouse after colonization happened because the colonizer men would sexualize them. I'm never wearing a blouse under my sari again.
Going through these photos, I felt embarrassed, first of all, for not researching Balinese culture further before traveling there. I also felt embarrassed that my exposure to Balinese culture was through a Westerner that traveled there and took pictures. It also made me question for the first time the impact that I had as a Western traveler. Not only that, there's photographic evidence showing a culture going from accepting female bodies to then being impacted by Western culture that shames women for having bodies, to then the Balinese people changing their own traditional outfits to becoming more conservative.
Obviously, there's been an economical and a political negative impact that Western culture and capitalism in general have had on the rest of the world, but also there has been an aesthetic negative impact. The women in Bali going from looking so taken care of and well-dressed and so expensive to just wearing flip-flops and a t-shirt, I don't know, it makes me sad, and it made me not feel so positive about myself traveling there, and it made me question what impact do I have as a traveler. And like I said, yes, it's Western culture, yes, it's capitalism, but what has had the biggest impact when it comes to Western aesthetics has actually been fascism. Surprisingly, which I found out recently, that minimalism has basically been, it's like the child of fascism. So this is the TikTok that kind of educated me on this. Enjoy.
Name a capitalist scam that we've all been conditioned to believe is totally okay.
Minimalism. Oh my god, minimalism. Remember when houses used to look like this? Probably not. Because we've been conditioned to believe the most ideal form of design looks more like this. All the time in the design world, minimalism is upheld as the gold standard. It's pushed almost as a spiritual form of lifestyle. Netflix even made this documentary, Minimalism, and documentary about the important things. However, complex ornamental design was a deep and significant part of human culture since the dawn of humans. Basically, since people started clothing themselves. It was until about 1931, when Adolf Loos, an Austrian architect, wrote Ornament and Crime. He compares excessive ornamentation to being something that's criminal and inhuman. You can pause here to read it. It's really bad. This is him, by the way. Ugh. The problem is, this essay became a seminal text in many architecture circles. There's a lot of really good minimal design out there. It's based on a history of cultural erasure and fascism. And I don't know, I just wish more of the world looked like this.
Also, on that note, I've said this before, but like white people should be just as upset as anyone about the homogenization of cultures under the name of white supremacy. Because white supremacy only exists and thrives if it's able to grow. And the way it has historically done that is by homogenizing cultures into some vague sense of whiteness. There are a lot of unique cultures that originate from light-skinned people. But a lot of white people today can't even really connect with that heritage because somewhere along the way they were absorbed into this all-encompassing sense of whiteness. The definition of which had to keep on expanding in order to stay powerful. Which is how you ended up with things like the Irish aren't white, wait, now they are. The Italians aren't white, wait, now they are. And we even see it today with y'all calling every person of color with features you find attractive white passing. Whiteness is constantly trying to hijack every culture it can so that it can remain as powerful as possible. And that has divorced even white people from their individual cultural identities.
So the reason why garments got so much more simplified is not only because of obviously the Industrial Revolution and how machines were making a few parts of our clothing, but also its aesthetic, and the aesthetic derives from the philosophy of fascism, of how everything needs to be simplified and utilitarian, and things like decorating clothing in ornate details are excessive and not really appreciated. This ideology leads to a lot of cultural erasure. A lot of the clothes that our ancestors traditionally wore were now considered gaudy or outdated or tacky, extra. A lot of negative connotations were put alongside being dressed in more stuff, in embracing cultural maximalism. Not only that, I think there's a little bit of misogyny there tied into that as well, because women were the primary garment makers, they were the primary garment artisans, and their art was immediately considered excessive and unnecessary and kind of discarded and forgotten. I find it kind of interesting that when I started wanting to dress more like me and wanting to express myself more through the way that I dress in the last year, I actually just became a lot more maximalist in the way that I dress. So back to fashion history. In the early 1900s, France and Italy were some of the first countries that started having fashion houses that are still in operation to this day, like Chanel and Prada. And what's also very interesting is that almost every single one of these fashion houses that are still in operation today, at least from my research, were started by men. And these fashion houses have now evolved into luxury brands that are worn by the elite rich and also coveted by the peasants that want to dress and look rich. So Grady, you're a peasant. You're the designated peasant. Do you want to wear Prada?
No.
What about Chanel?
Is that perfume?
Yes, Chanel is a perfume only.
By the way, what is a fashion house? Like I imagine that's like a place you go to if you wanna like lower your self-esteem.
Also, do you remember the time that I used to work at a bridal fashion house?
I do remember that.
Okay, so the guy there, he was the most like sexist, evil human.
Yeah, you told me about it.
I've told you about it, okay, but can I say it? No. And like he told me in the beginning, like I was first hired, and he was like explaining to me that like we make really expensive wedding dresses. He made me watch this like Apple video. It's like Steve Jobs like saying motivational Apple things.
Okay.
And he's like how important branding is, and that like the reason why people buy like a Dolce & Gabbana shirt or whatever is not because it's more expensive to make, but because they want something that poor people can't afford. And like that's what he wants to do. He was not talking about it sarcastically is what I'm saying. He was like dead serious. Like I want to make things that not everyone can afford. And so the reason why high-end garments are overpriced is not because it costs that much more to make them, although for some it does cost more, but that's not really it. But it's because they want the prices to be extremely unaffordable to pretty much everyone other than the elites, so that the elites can wear clothes and feel special, basically. But what's also interesting is that this comes in and out of fashion, where rich people want to dress like poor people. And so we've seen like back in the 90s and the 2000s when fashion houses were making ripped jeans a trend, or just in general, they were calling it hobo style. Do you remember that at all?
No.
You sweet summer child.
I was a baby.
You were a baby. The rest of us had to put up with that, even though they're still doing it, where they're just basically selling clothes to rich people so that they can look poor. Because I don't know why. I saw a TikTok about it, but I didn't save it, so I don't remember anymore. So as I mentioned, basically fascism led to minimalism in fashion, which led to the erasure of female artisanship in fashion. That also led to most evolution happening in fashion only being done through patterns, because pretty much almost every other detail was erased and discarded of and considered excessive. So things started changing in fashion in regards to like women being able to wear trousers or skirt hems getting shorter. So because of that, basically fashion design became the most important element in the production of garments. And therefore the fashion designers were the most important figures in garment production. That also means that men, because as I mentioned before, most of the fashion houses were founded by men, because men at the time were allowed to work. Women weren't really, and they weren't really allowed to start businesses and stuff like that. The few fashion houses that were started by women, it was usually because they were very wealthy, and so rules don't really apply so much to wealthy people. But because the most important part of the garment making process became fashion design, fashion designers started becoming worshipped, which is very interesting how this parallels the rise of capitalism, in which the person that is at the top of the production chain is considered the most important person, therefore should receive the most money, the most credit, and the most adoration by everyone. And that also starts happening within the fashion industry that slowly becomes more and more capitalistic as capitalism rises, where the designer is at the top and is seen as the most important figure, and everyone else kind of becomes less and less important as the pyramid, as you get closer to the base of the pyramid.
And as with every system of hierarchy that has a disproportionate distribution of power, affording power to the elite few and disempowering the majority, what happens is those that do have power exploit it. And one particular form of exploitation that is incredibly popular under capitalism that awards power predominantly to men is sexual exploitation. And in the last few years, the sexual exploitation in Hollywood has been uncovered, but the same exact thing is happening in the fashion industry.
And we can see that with the recent Alexander Wang drama. There's a lot of instances with very popular male fashion photographers like Mario Testino, Bruce Weber, Terry Richardson have all been accused of abusing models. But there's also the garment factory workers, especially in factories that produce clothes for fast fashion brands, that have reported getting sexually assaulted by the garment factory owners on a pretty much everyday basis. But this is something that is not a lot of people have paid attention to or have shined a spotlight on that because it's not happening in the West and therefore nobody cares, basically. But I believe that the garment factory workers that are making clothes, especially for fast fashion brands, are the biggest victims of the fashion industry. And again, they're the most disregarded ones. And what's fascinating is that even though the garment industry mainly produces items for the consumption of women, it's an industry that is still dominated heavily by men. Most fast fashion brands are male owned. Most luxury brands are designed by men.
It's interesting how women perpetuate sexism against themselves.
Well, here's the thing. Because, as I mentioned, the first fashion houses were started by men, the people that had the most opportunities to capitalize off of fashion were men. So fashion is supposed to be a space for women or for femininity, but in reality, it's something that has been hijacked by toxic masculinity.
So shouldn't women support female designers?
1000%.
So point a finger at the camera and be like, support female fashion designer.
Support your local female fashion designer.
The designer that I know is Alexander McQueen. There was like something on TV about him, and Petra was like, Lightning McQueen?
Lightning McQueen. I want to sit and watch this. Suddenly I'm interested in fashion. When is Lightning McQueen gonna start showing up?
That was great.
Is there a point where he goes from designing clothes to becoming a car?
His disappointment was immeasurable. I'm gonna go upstairs.
Okay, go quickly. Quickly, please.
Or if I go quiet.
No, quickly!
Bye. Good
Okay.
luck.
Good luck. Yeah, I need that. And it goes without saying that, yes, there are a lot of men in positions of power within the fashion industry, but there are also women in positions of power that perpetuate a lot of its toxicity. You know, these are women that definitely can get away with speaking up and standing up and changing things that are toxic within the fashion industry, yet they refuse not to because of girl boss culture, where it's basically money is more important than anything else.
The term girl boss was coined by the original girl boss, Sophia Maruso, who was the founder of Nasty Gal. Nasty Gal was an online vintage store that turned into a full-on fast fashion store, and it made her a millionaire. She's known for her horrible business practices and the mistreatment and exploitation of her staff.
There's also the issue of clothing within the fashion industry that are supposed to be for adults being modeled by teenagers, and that creates very unhealthy and unrealistic beauty standards for people.
For example, in this Chanel campaign, it's modeled by Kaya Gerber, who is now, I believe, 19 years old. I think when these pictures were taken, she was 18, and not a lot of 18-year-olds can afford clothing that is this expensive. But also the style is for an older, more mature consumer. It's not youthful clothing. In these pictures, she looks like a kid that went through her mom's closet and is wearing things for fun. I can't take these pictures seriously. This model is at a Dior fashion show, and she is 14 years old, and she's wearing a gown that is sheer, and I had to censor, and I've never felt like a bigger creep in my entire fucking life. Thank you so much for that, Dior. But I'm trying to give you an example of how fucking creepy this industry is. This is a very famous photo shoot of Kate Moss with Marky Mark modeling for Calvin Klein, and she was 16 years old at the time. And she has said in an interview that she felt extremely uncomfortable during this photo shoot. I wonder why.
But also when it comes to modeling, it's very disturbing how teenagers are used as the beauty ideal. It sets unrealistic beauty standards. It also sets unrealistic weight standards for women. And even though things have changed now, I was around in the 90s and I did in the early 2000s, and I heavily got exposed to the incredibly toxic and fat shaming culture that was around back then. Up until the 80s, models were thin, but they were not scarily thin. It was during the 90s where heroin chic kind of happened that things got very dark. Models were expected to be insanely thin during that time. I mean, not that now they're not, but things are getting a little bit better. So yeah, not only was fashion contributing to body shaming, but also contributing to diet culture that really took off during that time. And that was definitely a very big part of the reason why I also developed an eating disorder, and I think a lot of people during that time. And I still struggle to accept myself personally looking anything other than deathly thin, because during a critical time in my brain's development, I was subjected to images of emaciated women, and I was told that that's how I'm supposed to look. And it's very hard to decondition my brain from seeing it like that. Now, this is something that I mentioned in my video where I was talking about low-rise jeans coming back in style, where I discussed the concept of if you are making clothes that only look good on someone that is underweight, then I don't believe that you're a talented fashion designer. And I still very much stand behind that statement. I found another TikTok that I really like. And in that TikTok, they kind of explore the concept of, is this actually a stylish outfit, or is this person just skinny?
Welcome back to my Pinterest series, guys. Just a little disclaimer, this is not a personal attack against anyone, what I will be talking about today, but if you see it as one, maybe think about that, because I'm talking about the fact that I am missing the key accessory that makes these outfits so desirable and perfect to society, and that is a flat stomach. Flat stomachs are accessorized in the sense that they're an add-on to an outfit. People view an outfit as better because there's a flat stomach attached onto it, whereas a fat woman wears the same thing and we're viewed as gross, showing too much, provocative. That's fat phobia.
And I also found a TikTok with a list of pretty much every single popular fashion brand out there and the racism that they've taken part in.
It's time to dive into the world of luxury to see which brands are using racism to sell their fashion. Advertisements like these have been used as weapons of racial injustice for centuries. It continues to this day, not only in advertisement, but in fashion as well. Many people have requested a series on this, and here it is. For part 1, the brand we are featuring is Gucci. Since they were called out for this blackface sweater in 2019, they've done many more atrocities. Shortly following that incident, they sent turbans down the runway committing cultural appropriation. Summer of 2020, they sent straitjackets down the runway degrading people with mental health issues. September 15, 2020, they released this blackface makeup advertisement, remnant of Jim Crow era makeup. And directly after that ad, they released this ad, echoing the rising sun flag. Gucci is currently running these ads. Luxury brands that use racism to sell their fashion, part 13. So far we've seen Gucci, Dior, Prada, Louis Vuitton, Chanel, Versace, Dolce & Gabbana, Burberry, Marc Jacobs, Vivienne Westwood, and now it's time to look at highly requested Balenciaga. In 2018, they were called out for cultural appropriation of the Black community, taking credit for designs that are linked to hip-hop culture. They took the stolen artwork, made their luxury clothing, and profited off of it, taking all the credit. 2018, they were accused of cultural appropriation and stealing a design student's artwork. The student's name was Tra Mai Nguyen. Her art is inspired by Vietnamese heritage, focusing on women's motorbike culture. Here's her artwork, and here's Balenciaga's. Their response is they got their own inspiration. In 2020, Balenciaga launched 4 bags to celebrate the Qixi Festival, also known as the Chinese Valentine's Day. The bag was looked at as unsophisticated, but it was the advertisement that really angered people. This was taken as an insult, and now Balenciaga is promoting Gucci, who is promoting racism. And that's Balenciaga.
So I kind of want to discuss how the fashion industry operates like a cult.
Not only through the systemic predatory behavior that is directed towards minors, but also through overworking the quote-unquote believers. The fashion industry notoriously has some of the lowest wages and unsafe working conditions out of any industry, and that does not only include sweatshop labor. Many jobs within fashion are so heavily glamorized and romanticized that for many, some working positions are so heavily coveted that people accept working and getting paid either nothing or next to nothing. I remember when I had first started out vlogging, I think I was 19 years old at the time, and I was contacted by someone who had like a very small brand in an extremely expensive neighborhood in Athens. And he owned the location, and he had seen the pictures in my blog, and he had told me that he liked those pictures and that he was interested in working with me and me taking pictures of the stuff in his shop, basically. I remember thinking that this was a paid job. I was too embarrassed to ask, but I just naturally assumed it, because why would anyone ask me to work for them for free? That made no sense. And the second time that I went, or the third time, I asked him like, hey, I was just wondering, what is the wage for me taking pictures for you? And that's when I found out that this was a volunteer position. This is, I think, another reason why the fashion industry preys on young people, because when you are young, you are so much more naive, so much more gullible, so much more easier to exploit. And this wasn't the first or the last time of me feeling exploited while working in a fashion industry job.
My first job was at Pull & Bear, and what was really funny was that they hired me part-time but had me work 7 hours a day, not 8, because if I worked 8 hours a day, I'd get paid more, so they hired me part-time for that. Another thing that I find interesting is how people that are very interested in fashion are almost always broke. And I noticed that last year when I was on that godforsaken reality styling competition show. What I found very interesting with the people that I met, the people that were really into fashion and really into style never had any money, because they spend everything that they make on clothing. And so that kind of ties it into the pyramid scheme, where you work within the fashion industry, but basically you work to sustain the fashion industry because you're just so obsessed with clothes, so obsessed with being stylish and wearing different things for every Instagram picture, where basically everything that you make just goes back into it. And I find that kind of sad, because I've always loved dressing myself, but I love saving money more. And like, I definitely do understand, because there used to be a point in my life where I would just eat less in order to spend more on clothes. So I kind of know what it feels like, but I would expect that people grow out of that phase and not take it with them into their 30s. But I don't want to judge. And especially fast fashion is the biggest pyramid scheme, in my opinion, because not only is fast fashion responsible for spitting out trends constantly and creating the biggest pressure on consumers to change their style all the time and shop all the time, but also, as I've mentioned in millions of videos that I've made at this point, fast fashion is just the worst. Cheap garment overproduction in general requires very low-cost working hands, which leads obviously to worker exploitation and workers within the fashion industry, and of course workers within the garment industry making next to nothing. But also the overproduction of clothing is incredibly environmentally destructive, and that's the production of fabrics It's also the dyeing of the fabrics. It's the fabric processing in general. Very heavily polluting. The worst. And there's still people out there that like to say that ethical fashion is elitist or whatever. And just enjoy this TikTok because it perfectly explains every single hole in this argument.
But sustainable fashion is classist. You do realize that true sustainable fashion means things like buying less, buying used, giving and getting hand-me-downs, and mending your clothes, right? Lower income people often naturally participate in sustainable fashion. Or did you just want to use lower income people as an excuse for your $500 Shein haul?
So yeah, fast fashion does all of that. And not only that, another thing the fast fashion does is they put young designers out of business because not only are they stealing the designs of young independent designers that are usually women, but also pretty much every fast fashion brand is owned by a millionaire or a billionaire man. And they are not only stealing these designs from female artists, but they are also making these designs so cheap that the female creators can't compete with these prices. And in general, because fast fashion made garments so incredibly cheap, that destroys every single artisan within that industry that is trying to actually make a living out of it, because now people are like, oh yeah, I could pay you a fair wage for this, but I can literally get the cheap version for like nothing at H&M. So why would I pay you? And then on top of all the reasons why we hate fast fashion, the cheap production of clothing also contributes to the cultural and traditional erasure within the garment making process. So a lot of garment making techniques and traditions are kind of dying away because fast fashion is just producing things super cheaply and super low cost and very low quality as well. And so all these artisans that were making things that were genuinely beautiful and expensive and high quality, you know, nobody values their labor anymore, basically. Fast fashion has basically made us not value labor and artistic creation that is predominantly done by women. It's a very recent thing where we've started really underappreciating the tremendous labor and artisanship that goes into making clothes. And this definitely ties in with the previous video that I made about the capitalization of women in art and how, oh, hi baby. Oh my goodness, come here. Come on the table. There you go. Do not rip my Mugler blouse, okay? This is vintage Mugler. Yes, sit down. And so, yeah, this ties in to the last video that I made where I was talking about the capitalization of women in art and how not only were women not allowed to partake in art, but also whatever art women did was not really valued and was not seen as important. And it's very sad for us as women now that consider ourselves feminists and liberated to perpetuate the ideology that garment making is not an art form and it's not important or creative enough. We have to start looking up to garment making. We have to start looking up to artisans that are doing incredible things when it comes to fashion and clothing, but also jewelry and accessories and all that kind of stuff. And we need to start understanding that fashion is not meant to be cheap. Clothing is not meant to be cheap. And then there's other things within the fashion industry that just feel like a cult. One thing that I remember when I read the book Sapiens, in the beginning, it's describing how brands and logos are basically meaningless. The Prada logo means absolutely nothing. The Chanel logo means absolutely nothing. And that any item that is associated with that logo automatically achieves a higher value. The items don't change. It's just that we associate certain feelings and emotions and stories with the logos that are attached to those items. And that's achieved through advertisement and also through celebrity endorsements and in general associating these products with things that we deeply desire. Other things that might not be characteristics of cults, but definitely have a cult vibe are things like the Zara poses. I don't know, for some reason when I look at Zara catalog images, a lot of them just give me cult vibes. I don't know why. Another thing that gives me cult vibes is when everyone
wants to wear the same exact thing simply because it's from an expensive brand, not because it has anything special about it. One of those items is the Gucci belt. It's not only coveted by most people, but it's also seen as a status symbol that the wearer of this belt somehow is superior and has more wealth and, I don't know, better fortune. It is incredibly culty how objects with no value and nothing special about their appearance are somehow indicators of someone's status. Another notable mention in the things about the fashion industry that just kind of feel like a cult is wearing animals. Thankfully, we're no longer cavemen living during the Ice Age to require the fur of dead animals in order to stay warm. So yeah, killing animals in the name of fashion is a little unnecessary, if you ask me. I've made multiple videos about this, so I'm not going to get into much detail, but just a quick summary in case this is the first time you're hearing about this. My personal opinion regarding wearing animals is that as long as something is a hand-me-down or bought secondhand, I don't see it as a problem, but paying someone specifically to kill something for you to wear it is redundant, a little unnecessary, and, you know, psychotic. There's no other way to say it. We're killing cute animals and turning them into shoes and belts. We're disgusting. There you go. Despite all of that, I can't help but love fashion still. Despite how much pain and suffering it's caused me, I still just love clothes so much. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. I can't, she's so cute. But I love thrifting, and I love finding like vintage pieces like this. Like this is a vintage Mugler blouse, and you know, he's a man. Well, whatever. And I love, you know, exploring fashion history through thrifting, and I love the process of like putting outfits together, and I really, really, really want to get into making clothes and just, you know, using thrifted fabrics and stuff like that, or upcycling clothes. I really, really need a hobby other than just sitting around and binge watching TV shows and The Nanny. To me, no other art form is as fun as fashion because you literally get to experience your art on your own body and like wear it. Let me know in the comments below, what are your thoughts on this? If you have any. If you don't have any thoughts, then just drop a hat emoji or a shoe emoji. That'll do. Just engage in the comments, helps the algorithm. Also, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and a huge thank you to all of my patrons for supporting this channel and making these videos possible. Thanks so much for watching, and I'm gonna see you guys soon. Bye. What?
Just loop that clip of you drinking that. You gotta reach those 10 minutes for the algorithm.